London woke in a dim, pearled fog that made chimneys into muted reliquaries and drew a soft veil across the river's black ribbon. Gutters brimmed with last night's rain, and the presses on Fleet Street thrummed like iron hearts beating beneath the city's damp ribs, pushing warm sheets of newsprint that smelled of ink and metal and a kind of hope the city scarcely admitted even to itself. In a narrow garret at the roofline, where the window glass was a wavering film against the cold and the ceiling sloped as if bowed by too many secrets, Eleanor Hart set the nib of a silver fountain pen against a whetstone and sharpened it until it shone a blade made of brightness, her father's last gift, engraved so faintly his name might have been a ghost learning to speak. She wrapped her words inside the armor of a pen name and felt the strange safety of disguise slide over her like a second skin. A. Glass. The column she composed was cool, formal, devastating. It listed the irregularities at Street, Barton's home for foundlings, in a voice that did not accuse but revealed, naming gaps where blankets should have been, sums that vanished like steam from a kettle, a clerk gone suddenly and conveniently to sea, and it hinted at distinguished hands sluicing money from children to ballrooms where candles learned to burn past their wicks. Across the river, in a house quiet as a mausoleum whose vaults had been furnished instead of buried, Adrian Everley, the Duke of Merrow, read A. Glass with eyes that did not flinch. His late mother had endowed Street Bartons, and so the ink did not merely blacken his fingers, it landed like snowfall on embers, cooling what might have flared into denial and revealing instead the steady glow of a man who had learned to count loss carefully. Weeks passed, the city repeated a refrain until it folded into coffeehouse cant and was dropped into conversations like a coin to test its ring. What is kept in the dark withers. Eleanor watched from door jambs and the shadows cast by lamp-posts as printers whispered and gentlemen paled, as a barmaid tucked the phrase into a laugh and a barrister into a cough. She noticed where the skin of London thinned to let light through. A rain-slicked boy called Kit ran with her sealed copy pinned beneath his arm, a narrow arrow through puddles and horsemuck, up the steps to Mr. Silas Fallow, her editor, who muttered blessings and bargains with the damp as if he could haggle with weather itself, his spectacles fogged, his fingers stained. He said he would look after the words as if they were candles cupped in a gale. Eleanor paid him with cautious trust and a tremor of fear that she kept hidden like a bruise under a sleeve. Fear was part of the price of attention, and she had no coin more honest to spend. In her window, a pressed violet in a locket caught the pale light, the petals dark as an evening promise and rimmed by a thin ring of silver. She touched it and thought, under glass, things survive, then remembered her father's cough echoing from a debtor's cell and corrected herself softly. Under glass, things survive until they can be brought into air. The city breathed clouds. The column went out. Somewhere, a matron at Street. Barton's folded linens thinner than conscience, while a titled man stared at a ledger and felt, for the first time in a long while, the weight of a page. And Eleanor, listening to the presses throb through the fog, believed that words could yet warm what was frozen, even as a scented warning, not yet written but on its way, composed itself in the hands of those who preferred the dark. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. At White's, where the air held the faint musk of old leather and civility, a scrap of newsprint passed from gloved hand to gloved hand like contraband, folded and unfolded until the crease grew pale as an old scar. Men who knew how to pretend indifference failed at it in small ways. An extra glance at a comma, a thumb pressed too long on a name, a laugh that did not quite rise. The Merrow Trust, once a synonym for propriety, suffered a ripple no one could quite name. Raised brows, lowered voices, a cough inserted where a defense might have been. Meanwhile, Adrian Everley endured a cordial inquisition with the stillness of a man accustomed to weathering squalls at sea by becoming part of the ship, answering nothing with an austere silence that made certain men itch and others reconsider their questions. Across the river, in her high, narrow room, Eleanor Hart unthreaded a skein of accounts with the same patience she used to remove a burr from her shawl. The silver pen shone like a small moon in her grip, as she drew a line from a green leather ledger to a vanishing sum to a clerk who had conveniently gone to sea, and then she set those lines in type-weary prose, each sentence a measured step across black ice. She did not name Merrow. She was not foolish. She merely pointed her lantern toward the pattern and suggested that protection, when misapplied, can look very like a title casting too long a shadow. Mr. Silas Fallow read her copy with his spectacles pushed to his forehead and a bruise blooming old wine at his temple. Headlines make enemies, he rasped through dry humor that could not quite hide concern, and Eleanor, who had learned to hear love when it spoke in warnings, inclined her head as if she were admitting a debt. That afternoon, a note slid under her door as neatly as a knife. It was written in a firm, perfumed hand on thick paper, and it read, "Cease, Mr. Glass, before the glass shatters." She held it between finger and thumb as if it might stain. Her locket flashed in the window like a peal of light imprisoned, the violet beneath its shield, as dark as pulled ink, and she whispered, "Under glass, things survive." Not as comfort now, but as reminder of fragility. As autumn arrived and the wind developed a debtor's cough she knew too well, she pulled her thin shawl tighter and walked the long arithmetic of costs, laying courage on one side, silence on the other, hearing her father's chain-dulled breath in the gusts that prowled the eaves. At dawn, Adrian took himself to Street Barton's and found blankets threadbare as excuses, a pantry not yet empty but rehearsing how it would be, and a matron whose gratitude and dread flickered in her eyes, like an altar candle unsure of its supply. His jaw set like winter, not to break but to endure, and he said little because words do work best when they are not spent cheaply. A philanthropy gala was announced with the brisk efficiency of a laundry list balsams and waltzes to cleanse what ink had soiled, and Mrs. Lavinia Vale, in generous ignorance, secured Eleanor a place as her companion, proud to offer a young woman a doorway while oblivious to the ink that already marked Eleanor's hands, invisible to anyone not looking with their conscience. In his study, where the fire spoke in low, companionable crackles and the desk bore the indentations of a mother's signatures, Adrian wrote to A. Glass with a soldier's economy. Meet me each letter a nail struck true. He did not beg nor threaten. He merely aligned himself with the phrase, "The city could not stop repeating," that what is kept in the dark withers, and vowed, in the private register a man uses when he speaks first to himself, to find what rotted without crushing what still, against all odds, bloomed. Crystal chandeliers freckled the walls with cold stars, each prism cutting the gaslight into shards that trembled across gilt and gilted smiles. The room smelled of beeswax and orchestral varnish, and of violets bruised under slippered feet, of money learning to call itself benevolence. Eleanor arrived on Mrs. Vale's arm, a shadow among silk grey, among spun suns, with her silver pen tucked in her reticule like a concealed blade, and the familiar weight of the locket at her throat, the pressed violet under glass a cool pulse against her skin. Adrian Everley stood taller than rumour, near a column fluted like winter, watching the room with the look of a man who hears waves beneath the music. He seemed to listen past the violins to some feral truth just outside the windows, where rain clouded the panes and the city pressed its face to the glass. His gaze slid past faces that had learned to be arrangements rather than expressions, and landed, unbidden and without permission taken, on the profile of Mrs. Vale's companion, the steady line of her mouth, the intelligent watchfulness that made the distance between her and the world look like a choice rather than a sentence. When at last they found themselves at the same corner of a table where sugared almonds lay like complacent stones, their first words were the formal nothings that civility requires and desire mistrusts. "The weather is obstinate," Eleanor said, as if speaking to the air instead of to a duke, her voice as composed as a ledger line. "London enjoys its own ideas," he returned, with the smallest inclination that made courtesy feel like respect, and beneath the exchange, a tremor. Respect, recognizing its twin, moved like groundwater, unseen but irresistible. A donor, pink with champagne and self-regard, struck a spoon to a glass and toasted street. Barton's, naming the Merrow Trust as if it were incense that could cleanse the temple. Eleanor felt the room's hypocrisy cinch like stays, the applause like rain on tin, noisy, unabsorbed, and she noted, with a keenness that surprised her, how the Duke of Merrow did not smile, not even in the careful way men smile when they intend to mend reputations with vowels. Lady Severin, pearls like teeth at her throat, drifted close and purred into a cluster of listeners that, Glass must be a bitter old barrister with moths in his pockets, and nothing in his heart but dust. Eleanor, who had spent the afternoon teaching her heartbeat to keep dignified time, let her mouth shape a test as if it were a trifle, one might say, and here she echoed herself with a chill of daring, that what is kept in the dark withers. She watched the Duke without looking as one watches a kettle, to hear if it will boil. His answer came without flourish, dry as the humour that keeps a man from drowning, and it startled her into a steadiness she had not expected. "And what is exposed too carelessly burns," he said, "even if it is good wood." The dance began. Chairs scraped, the pattern of couples rearranged like an abacus flicked by an impatient hand. In the compressions and expansions of the set, her gloved fingers brushed his no claim, no permission asked or granted, only the brief electricity of contact that made the cost of anonymity ring her bones and the danger of being seen flare hot as a match. She could feel the pen in her reticule, the way a soldier feels a knife at the small of the back, not for killing, but for cutting knots. The music swelled. A cousin whose smile did not reach his eyes watched like a cat pretending sleep. Laughter gilded the surfaces where rot had been sanded thin. Eleanor stepped through a French door onto a narrow balcony where rain needled the dark, and the fog rose off the river like breath from a sleeping beast. London smelled of iron and possibility. She set her palms upon the cool stone and breathed fog and ink until her heart found its rhythm. Under glass, she thought, things survive, but I did not come only to preserve. She pictured a single thread pulled until the whole garment of lies slackened and fell, and she vowed, with the quiet ferocity of one who keeps her promises as carefully as her secrets, to tug and tug until the city shivered and knew itself in air. Inside, the chandeliers went on making stars. Outside, the rain stitched them closed, and somewhere between, in the space where two hands had met and not been introduced, something patient and inexorable began. Fog thinned to a pale gauze by mid-morning when the carriages rolled to a halt before street. Barton's, the stones clean as if someone had scoured them with hope, and Adrian Everley, who had invited a respectable party with the steadiness of a man opening his own windows to the street, named it transparency and swallowed the insult of spectacle, as one swallows a bitter draught for its virtue rather than its taste. Mrs. Vale fluttered like a benevolent bird, introducing her companion as if good sense were a shy cousin, and Eleanor, sensible of the pen sleeping in her reticule and the locket's cool coin at her throat, watched the children assemble their careful smiles, the matron's gratitude arrive on cue and leave an echo. The rooms dressed in soap and sunlight, the way a poor girl dresses on feast days, clean, tight, a seam threatening to part. In a corridor smelling faintly of boiled starch and damp wool, a boy's hand darted at a basket and returned with an apple so quickly that it almost seemed the fruit had chosen him. Eleanor caught his wrist gently, then turned the apple in her palm and, with a conspirator's glance, tucked a second into his fingers. "A game," she murmured, soft as chalk on a slate. "One for speed, one for honesty. Return the second when you can." The boy, disarmed by being seen and not punished, grinned with an authority beyond his years and vanished into a doorway where laughter had a habit of becoming work. The office, when they reached it, held the sober perfume of dust and lie. Shelves stood in orderly ranks, and yet the space felt as if a chair had been removed from a table where one eats alone. Eleanor let her gaze settle, unhurried, and found where absence makes its own outline, a gap the size of a green leather ledger, conspicuous as a missing tooth. The clerk, a man with ink on his cuffs and too much air in his words, blamed a recent inventory and gestured toward a stack of papers that tried, poorly, to look official. A tide of dread rose coolly along Eleanor's ribs, not panic, but the clean recognition that someone had been early to the scene. Adrian had slipped from the tide of visiting voices to kneel beside a little girl whose hair had been parted with military precision. He asked, not as a duke but as a man auditing his own soul, "Tell me, does the milk taste kind today?" She blinked at the oddity of the question and then nodded, solemn, as if conferring a grade. His smile, small and unadvertised, altered the climate of the room enough that Eleanor felt her certainty crack to admit a patch of light, and she resented and welcomed that weather both. Weeks passed. Her columns praised the honest bones. She had seen the laundry's uncomplaining steam, the nurse whose hands remembered lullabies, and yet insisted on rot in the roof. missing numbers, diverted parcels, a pattern that resisted hats and handshakes. Readers, who could tell a cudgel from a scale, began to call A. Glass fair and fairness, like rain, found its level. In a hushed corridor where footsteps sounded like secrets walking, Eleanor and Adrian exchanged words no wider than the passage they stood in, and a conversation about mercy and mathematics that felt like laying two palms against the same door. "Compassion is not a column to be entered," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "And yet if we will feed them next month as well as this, we must count," he answered. And there was no thunder in it, only the moral weight of a man who had taught himself to be heavy where it matters. She felt the gravity of him without the anchor of a name she could trust with her own, and she thought, not without dread and a small, hard hope, we might yet make a ledger that remembers faces. That night, in her narrow room, where the wind combed the eaves and the fire whispered thrift, Eleanor wrote, until her pen scratched like a carriage wheel in snow, stopping only when she found the sentence that left room for grace without letting guilt escape. That what is kept in the dark withers, yes, but that brought to light with care may be pruned, not burned, so that it might, if it can, bloom in air. Dawn came grey and acrid to Fleet Street, the fog tasting of cinder, behind Mr. Fallow's print shop. The brick was blackened to a sorrowing shine, and smoke clawed at the morning as if trying to re-enter a throat. Fallow himself, hat askew and hair woolly with heat, laughed too loud, the brittle mirth of a man who has just seen the price of breath, and swept embers with hands that shook so finely a gentleman's watch might have mistaken them for seconds. Eleanor arrived with Kit, who darted like a heartbeat to fetch pails, and the scent of scorched paper, alphabet, unmade. Sentences interrupted at the vowel stung her eyes until tears chose their own reason. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and tasted soot, old as London and new as this hour, and the chill resolution it left behind was clean as a blade. The line must harden. In her narrow window later, the locket caught what light there was, the pressed violet serene beneath its small shield, and she repeated in the privacy of breath, "Under glass, things survive," even as fear rang her bones like a finger run around a glass's rim, a note pure and dreadful. She tucked the fear away the way a housemaid tucks loose hair, not gone, only disciplined. Across the river, Adrian read the fire in a ledger of his own, a report, a whiff in the frosted air, a smear on the finger of a runner. He sent his men quiet as ghosts, honest as hunger to watch the presses as if guarding a cradle, and in his mind refused the canonization that society offered too easily to those who do nothing. He would not be a patron saint of silence. Before noon, a note arrived at Merrow House, sealed with jade wax that gleamed like a wry eye. Inside, 3 words and a bell-rung hour: meet, Church of Street Bride, midnight. He recognized his own invitation, thrown back upon him without ornament, the rebuke of brevity, answering the economy of a soldier, and in the small, unsmiling curve of his mouth there was something like hope that the courage of the pen would fit the hand that held it. Mrs. Vale, catching the story in the air the way a housewife catches rain in a basin, fretted, sent for her companion, pressed 2 extra shawls upon Eleanor, as if layers might buffer scandal, and kept a wary eye upon her as one watches the floorboards for a tremor before a shelf of porcelain goes to shatter. "Do not walk alone," she murmured, which was both advice and prophecy, and Eleanor smiled the obedient smile of a woman who has already chosen her disobedience. At White's, where moral arithmetic is done with counters of rumour, Viscount Hargreave suggested, negligent as a cat toying with dignity, that a public rebuttal would crush A. Glass like a beetle under a gentleman's boot. Adrian, who had placed his palm on stone older than his title and found it warm with other lives, suggested truth might serve better than the theatre of a denial, and their jaws set like opposing cliffs that had learned the sea's patience. As bells tolled the quarters into a city that had learned to hold its breath and now to count it, Eleanor wrapped herself in a borrowed cloak and slipped into streets washed thin by moonlight. The cobbles held last night's rain like memory holds the shape of sorrow, and the wind, knife-edged and bracing, read her resolve and did not argue. She stepped past sleeping shop fronts and cat's-eye alleys, past the char at the back of the print shop that still smoked as if it had words to finish, and she counted her steps like prayers, one for the boy who ran messages with ink on his fingers, One for the editor who swept embers and laughed too loud, one for the Duke who had said and not said, one for the children who could not afford her fear until the spire of street. Brides rose pale and precise above the roofs, a tiered cake for a city that rarely tasted celebration, and the hour arrived, a clean note in the air, asking boldness to answer to its name. Street brides received them, as a confidant receives a secret stone, cool with centuries, and yet tender with candle breath, its vaults collecting whispers, the way hollows collect rain, the nave, a dim inland sea where halos and shadows rocked upon one another. Eleanor slipped into a screened pew, the carved lattice-work between her and the aisle a protection old as guilt, and when she spoke her voice was steady, as clean paper laid to blot, unembellished, unafraid of silence. "Sir," she said, not naming him, not needing to, "you asked for a meeting. You have one." On the other side of the screen, Adrian stood at a respectful remove, the straightness of his back reading as penitence to a stranger, and as endurance to anyone who had watched him learn it. His words came with the soldier's economy that had already struck her. No performance, no plea, only a stake driven into ground. "I confess neither crime nor virtue," he murmured, the low register taking the chill from the stone, "only a hunger for a city that can bear to see itself. Help me find what withers." The phrase, thrown back at her from the public page into this private nave, rang with a sincerity she felt in the bones of her hand, which tightened on the prayer book, not to pray but to steady. She tested him, because to believe without trial is how cities rot. "Tell me," she said, "in the East Dormitory, what lives above the hearth when the dawn is late?" A flourish would have betrayed him. Instead he answered as if placing a fact where it belonged. "Smoke that tastes of tallow and old soap," he said. "The chimney draws poorly when the river sits, and the children wake with throats lined as if with chalk. The matron gives them treacle then, if she can spare it." Respect, which had been an unlit thing between them, found its wick and took gentle flame. She did not let it blaze. The bell marked the quarter, a clean bronze note that lifted and fell along rafters smoothed by time. Eleanor's fingers found the oaken rail where countless palms had worn a shine into labor, into vows, into bargains, signed with pressure rather than ink, and she thought, how many arrangements have been made between mercy and necessity in these shadows? She spoke her conditions the way one writes a rule at the top of a ledger. "I will set down only what can be proved by hand and number," she said. "No rumor, no vengeance, no guest dressed for the stage," he answered in kind. "I will pry open the locks you name," he said quietly. "Not with title, when title is a cudgel, but with keys the law lends an honest borrower." They stood like two hands on one clock, separate, aligned, moved by the same mechanism toward a common hour. She felt the danger and the discipline of it. We must be very careful, and he felt the rightness that is not relief but resolve. When she rose to leave, the church pressed its cold upon her with affection. In the dim narthex, she nearly collided with a figure too warm for winter, a sweetness of scent that read as malice in the dark, powder and violet muddled with something metallic. A gloved hand brushed hers, soft as apology, and held nothing but a chill, the grip of a warning delivered without words. She did not break stride. Rain needled the churchyard like a seamstress intent on mending the sky. Adrian, who had not named her even to himself, watched the small, hooded shape cross the uneven stones and vanish into the wet as if absorbed by it. And the city, their obstinate, beloved, mendacious city, held its breath again, as if listening for a sentence being composed, as if it understood that what was kept in the dark would wither unless two disciplined hearts brought it into light with care. The tip came folded into Kit's palm like a fledgling worm, tremulous, needing the right release, and sent Eleanor east of street. Paused to a counting house, whose panes were smeared with the breath of clerks and the grease of too many hands, the air ink sour and lit with the dull shine of lard oil. There, through the glass, she watched a green leather ledger rise and vanish upon a counter, as if a fish had broken the surface and gone under. A clerk's sleeve obligingly wide when gentlemen approached, narrow as a conscience when a washerwoman did. She noted also a crate stenciled with a modest falsehood, household goods, and chalked with a symbol she had learned to read, as if it were her own name, a mark that would find the docks as unerringly as need finds night. She made herself small, a companion's companion, a person no one saw twice, and when the door of a side office clicked to and the corridor hushed, she slipped in on the hinge of a moment with a hairpin and a heartbeat for tools. The lock confessed with a sigh, and within were drawers as prim as governesses, one of which yielded paper onion thin and a list of names written with a hand that liked to starve its letters. Severin, Hargreave. Several subsidiaries whose gentility was a disguise for tributaries feeding the great river of the Merrow Trust, or parts of it corrupted. She copied with a calm pulse the silver pen her father had left, moving as if she were mending a torn seam, and the onion skin whispered under her palm as it folded, a conspirator who knew the value of quiet. Adrian, 3 streets and a world away, acted through a magistrate. He trusted the way a man trusts cold iron, without affection, with respect. He traced the crate from tally to tally until a warehouse opened its mouth to them and yielded not potatoes or linen, but blankets meant for street. Bartons cut down to shawls that would flirt at Covent Garden stalls. Charity nipped to fashion with shears that glittered in another person's pocket. He stood in the fug of tar and damp wool, with a fury as colourless and useful as winter light. Weeks passed, and the pattern began to declare itself the way a frost declares fern. Charitable goods diverted, funds laundered through elaborate kindnesses that advertised virtue while starving it. Eleanor's columns shed adjectives and acquired coordinates, became maps that readers tucked into themselves, into coats and common sense, the city learning to follow lines rather than voices. At a musicale where the air was steeped in lilac water and opinion, Viscount Hargreave mentioned A. Glass, with a negligent smile that had cut its baby teeth on cruelty. Eleanor, seated 3 chairs away behind Mrs. Vale's ruffles, tilted her head and inquired in a voice useful as a pin, "Have the green leather ledgers balanced at last, my lord?" He blinked a beat too long, one missed step before replying something elegant and empty. She felt the wordless click of a card being kept, her face filed among curiosities to revisit when the room was not listening. Later, in a library whose fire made a sound like paper, deciding to live, Adrian read the copies she smuggled through their book and stopped at a flourish he knew too well, the tight, arrogant sting, where numbers were made to serve the name Hargreave, and he felt blood and duty stain the same glove, the old house of loyalty settling upon its foundations with a noise like warning. That night, Eleanor held the onion skin sheets up to candlelight in her narrow room. The figures shone through like constellations seen from a stairwell, her hand trembling not from fear but from the reverence of discovery. What is kept in the dark withers, she reminded herself, and felt both astronomer and trespasser, both the eye that maps and the foot that crosses a threshold. The locket at her window caught a small flame and returned it, the violet beneath glass, serene as ever, and she thought, with an ache that steadied itself into purpose, under glass, things survive, under light, they bloom. Winter made itself grand in Lady Severin's rooms, mirrors staging an empire of reflections where faces multiplied into suspicion, gas jets crowned in glass tulips, breathing an illusion of summer, floors polished to a dangerous honesty, servants passed gossip upon silver as deftly as syllabub, and in more than one waistcoat pocket, a folded column by A. Glass pulsed like a hidden nerve, its familiar refrain, "What is kept in the dark withers," now a private password between men who affected not to read. Eleanor entered on Mrs. Vale's arm the way a shadow enters a lantern's circle, visible only if one watched the negative space. Her reticule held her father's silver pen and her caution, and when Adrian bowed to her, taller than rumors had measured him, she felt the peculiar steadiness of being seen as no one and as entirely herself. They danced once when the orchestra unspooled a waltz like measured snowfall. Their conversation was the kind that leaves no fingerprints. "The weather keeps its counsel," she offered, smiling at an angle. "It instructs us in patience," he returned. The ghost of weariness in the word, instructs, yet their eyes spoke in paragraphs, neither dared yet inscribe. In his gaze she heard the river under the music, the moral current he had learned to read by moonlight. In hers he found a shore that did not flee, that might even teach a tide. The floor spun, the chandeliers threw algebra upon the walls. She thought, with a private ache, "We must be very careful," and felt his hand answer with the slight courtesy pressure that in another life would have been permission to laugh. Hargreave's gaze found her then, a prickle one feels before one knows one's skin has been read. With a negligent smile he arranged the smallest conspiracy. "A shawl, Miss Hart. The draught in these old corridors is a traitor," and sent her to a side passage that obligingly emptied, like a room that knows not to witness. He followed on slippered silence and leaned too near, the scent of fine tobacco and something colder. "One should not stare too long into glass," he murmured, the syllables soft enough to be mistaken for courtesy. "It reflects what we would rather not see." Danger is not always loud. Her heart beat itself into a trim, serviceable speed. She kept her chin and replied, "Only cowards break mirrors they fear," and would have paid for the sentence if a step had not sounded behind them, as casual as a spare breath. "Miss Hart," Adrian said, as if the corridor were merely an observatory and not a snare, his tone the temperature of politeness. "Have you noticed the stars tonight? Even London has not quite taught them to dim." The moment broke and cooled. Severin herself appeared like a chorus in pale silk, simpering about draughts and shawls. Eleanor returned to the ballroom with her heartbeat still running and her resolve endowed with new muscle. In a card-room glazed with smoke and calculation, Adrian listened without listening to a Earl's complaint until the murmur beneath conversation sharpened. A plan to move certain crates by barge before dawn, a slip of tide to wash a ledger clean. He placed a glove on a chair as if a hand still warmed it, and left so that no one could later say he had flown. Eleanor, already halfway out of her fear, found a small writing table under a staircase where a fern dreamed of summer. She penned a note to M, no name, only the initial and a quick sketch of dock pilings, a clock hand at the hour, the word before, and folded the onion skin so that it whispered obedience. Kit, summoned with a look and a coin, and the old instruction, "Run like wind," took it as if it were a bird he meant to set down whole on another windowsill. The city, when they emerged, had dressed itself in a snow that gentled filth and muffled hoof and cry. The flakes stitched shut the obvious seams, while beneath the quiet the schemes scraped on, rat small and certain, behind the wainscoting of civility, where wolves sometimes borrowed gloves and called themselves cousins. The winter garden at Merrow House breathed its tempered jungle into the cold, the glass sweating a pale bloom of frost at the edges where the heat failed, the citrus leaves glazed with a faint light like patience, the soil damp and dark as a well, and it was there that Adrian received Mr. Fallow, hat in both hands, collar showing a tremor of snow-melt and confusion, the man's eyes still startled from having doubled back through lanes to shake a tail. Fallow produced a sheaf wrapped in a sheet torn from a ledger's back and muttered that Miss Hart, he corrected himself to our contributor, had been forced to run and had thrust the draft at him with the instruction to deliver it where it would breathe. Adrian read beneath the ferning panes. The cold sun magnified and sifted until the page glowed. The sentences possessed their habitual economy and their surprising mercy. But what struck him was the way they moved, the cadence of precision refusing spectacle. The echo of a waltz kept modest and exact. The woman he had danced with spoke through the ink, not in flourish but in the choice of a verb. The abstinence from ornament he now understood as a devotion. As he turned a page, a handkerchief that had been packed unknowing with the papers slid like a finch from a nest and landed near his boot. He stooped to it and saw, in the exact center, the smallest embroidery violet petals enclosed by a ring as delicate as breath, a flower kept beneath the suggestion of glass. His memory, obedient and disobedient at once, fetched a glimpse from months past her locket at her throat on the day of street. Barton's tour catching a strip of winter and holding it a pressed violet serenely captive, and brought it alongside the sentence she had favored. The sentence his city now repeated as if it were a proverb. Under glass, things survive. The mind that had trained itself never to leap leapt, the facts aligned as if mercifully pushed. Glass was Eleanor Hart, and his relief and his fear rose together like two hands of the same wave, to lift and threaten in a single motion. I will tell no one, he thought, and felt the oddity of making a vow to another person's secret with his own blood. His heart, which had kept his mother's injunctions like a code of arms, broke rank quietly, without drama, only a loosening where duty and desire had been tied until the knot bruised. Snow thickened beyond the panes. He left the greenhouse and walked halls lit low, the portraits on the walls returning him, his own features altered by lineage. He counted the bargains men make with themselves, the trades of silence for safety, of truth for usage, and chose, with the steadiness of a man choosing flint, to betray no one but guilt. In a modest room across the city, Eleanor trimmed a candle and felt a change before she knew its cause. That curious pressure of a truth entering a space ahead of its declaration. Careful, she told herself with the old discipline, and the flame steadied as if it had been admonished. Weeks passed. In drawing rooms their meetings remained ceremonial, bows measured, sentences clean of pronouns that would betray intimacy. In the corridors of docks and offices their work grew choreographed, each the other's unspoken timing, trust becoming not a feeling but a practiced step, hazard threading every seamman lingering at corners, a carriage too often behind a carriage. The greenhouse made a theatre of winter light. Frost wrote ferns on the glass and then melted them. When the hour sat quiet and no footman came, Adrian set the papers aside and, as if rehearsing a name he could not say aloud, wrote a single letter upon his palm with the stub of a carpenter's pencil E, and closed his fist around it, not to crush but to keep, a man holding both a secret and a standard. The winter garden's breath rose in a faint, clean steam against the panes, and drops gathered where the glass met the cold, as if the day itself could not decide whether to weep or bless. Adrian stood with his hands open, not in supplication but in the disciplined posture of a man who has rehearsed gentleness, and when Eleanor stepped in from the corridor's dusk, shedding the city one bead of fog at a time, he said her name, as if releasing it from a paper wrapping, careful not to bruise the syllables. Miss Hart, Eleanor. A flinch moved through her, then steadied. She lifted her head the way one does before swallowing something that heals and stings. Yes, she answered, and because she had always preferred an honest precipice to a comfortable lie, she went on with the plainness of clean ink. I am A. Glass. I write because my father's cough learned to echo against debtor's stone, because a child who must count her bread will one day count what was stolen and find that she was taught to do it by those who smiled. I chose the pain to speak through because under glass, things survive, sometimes the flower, sometimes only the fact. I do not apologize. She watched him as if watching weather for a crack in the cloud. He did not break. I suspected, he said, and in his voice no triumph, only a weariness that gentled itself into respect, and I have carried the knowledge like a lamp cupped between two hands. My house is loud with a mother's charity long after she is gone, and I made of duty a solitude when it should have been a door. I did not watch closely enough where my name went when it went to church. His mouth shaped the word with equal reverence and suspicion, and if there is failure in me, it is not from disbelief but from late attention. I am attempting, Miss Hart, to be on time to my own conscience. In the hush that grew leaf tremor, the quiet drip of a watered pot, something raw in both of them found, not its cure, but its dressing. The air had the confessional clarity of winter light that shows and warms in the same moment. Then let us be exact, she said, and her voice did not tremble. We work as partners. Unadorned, the word wore a perilous honesty by romance. The silence agreed and disagreed at once. Between them, the unsaid yet hung like fruit at a height they did not reach for and could not help seeing. He inclined his head, a soldier's acceptance of terms, and drew from his pocket a key tied with a plain thread, iron cool and ordinary as truth. Not to my heart, he said, almost smiling at his own caution. To a storage room beneath Merrow House. Old accounts sleep there. If rot lives in the roof, the dust will have kept its record. Take this as a practical trust. Her hand, when it received the metal, trembled once betrayal of a discipline otherwise immaculate, and she stilled it with her other palm. Tears stood obediently where they had been told to stand and not fall. We must be very careful, she murmured, and the sentence set itself like a refrain in both their minds, to be recited later in corridors and on wet streets, and in the white spaces between words. He nodded as if sealing a compact with the air. Outside, the fog thickened and exhaled against the glass. Inside, the leaves answered with their delicate shiver. Somewhere in the damp soil of that warm room, the first root of their true alliance, small and pale and stubborn, turned itself toward whatever light could be trusted. Winter narrowed the days until the light felt like a strict tutor and the air like a ledger balanced in ice, and into that paired season Eleanor and Adrian let their words travel in a manner that pleased their mutual caution. A book passed along the length of a library shelf, its calf binding unremarkable among histories and sermons, a hollow carved carefully into its pages to cradle envelopes that smelled of ink and dust. He left it beneath a window that faced a square of white sky. She fetched it as if consulting the index of Rome, and between them a correspondence grew that was precise in its verbs and disciplined in its tenderness, their affections kept to the margins like notes that only the careful will ever see. She wrote the plain archaeology of her childhood as if laying out shards on a table she could finally name of a house gone to auction, while she stood in the doorway and counted chairs by tens to pretend it was arithmetic and not grief, of a mother whose hands became pale flags over basins whitening other people's linens, of a father whose palm had always been warm and ink-stained, until the day shackles cooled it, and she learned that sound could echo without returning comfort. She did not ask sympathy. She set down the facts and trusted him to hear the heartbeat inside them. He answered with the weather of his own making, a map of shame he had begun to unfold with trembling steadiness. A fire 3 years past the orphanage wing that went like paper, the small girl carried in his coat, while smoke wrote its quick script on his lungs, the fiancé who measured the heat and chose a life unscorched by another's ruin, and how he had let duty harden into enclosure until it cracked under this winter's honest cold. "I am learning to be on time," he wrote, to my own conscience. Between letters they met in the unremarkable traffic of days, and their work turned their separate steps into a single gate. In the rooms beneath Merrow House the old accounts woke, and their entries knitted and unknitted under their eyes until a pattern emerged clear as boot tracks across new snow, numbers crossing and recrossing, charitable goods diverted with a thief's courtesy, Hargreaves' tight hand and Severin's leisurely flourish appearing and vanishing like signatures in fog. Elegance, they discovered, could be another word for theft that had taught itself posture. Weeks passed, gestures accumulated into a weather of their own, his coat draped over her shoulders before she could be cold, her fingers finding his sleeve when a crowd pressed and mistook her for ordinary, laughter arriving unannounced at a remark barely spoken, and leaving its ghost on a windowpane as if to say, "Remember, there are surfaces that hold joy." Mr. Fallow, who had always laughed as if bargaining with damp, came one dusk with a cheek the color of plum and a cut neat as a line of type. He pressed Eleanor's fingers until she could have counted the bones and whispered with a voice that did not ask permission to tremble, "Do not stop." She did not. That night the column she wrote read like prayer and law entwined, its clauses fastening with the gravity of vows, its mercy refusing spectacle. She praised what was true, named what was not, lit a lantern and opened a ledger, and set upon the page the sentence the city had begun to repeat, now altered in her mouth into a promise made to themselves as much as to London. What is kept in the dark withers. She held the locket that trapped a violet and, not for the first time, thought, under glass, things survive. But she also felt the new vow that beyond the glass there would be air, and they would make a world where the living did not need a shield to keep their color. The warning came carved into rough pine, as if impatience had taken a knife to wood and left its temper there. Glass breaks, letters gouged into a crate slat propped against Mr. Fallow's press like a prophecy or a dare. Eleanor read it with blood that seemed at once to crystallize and to run faster, a river under ice. And before fear could borrow her name, she was already tying her shawl, already writing a line to Adrian with a hand that looked steadier than she felt. Southwark Docks, if there is a trap, let it spring where I may see its teeth. The river's breath found her first. Tar and salt and smoke, ropes weeping black and gulls drawing thin chalk arcs on a sky, the color of dirty pewter. Her shawl snapped about her like a ragged flag, insisting on its own small sovereignty as she ran between stacks and shadows, counting pilings the way once she had counted chairs, telling herself, for breath, for kit, for the ledger that is a city's conscience. Adrian arrived with 2 men in plain coats, whose eyes were bright with that grim gentility that has learned what mercy costs. He had brought a plan that assumed pain rags for blindfolds or bandages, rope for binding or saving, a purse to quiet a watchman if blood made the argument louder than justice, and the calm that had steadied him in fire. Inside the warehouse, tar and fear sweetened the air into something that clung. Hargreaves' men stepped from between bales like commas, interrupting a sentence to insert their own meaning, and a knife showed itself the way truth sometimes does, brief, cold, utterly sure of its edge. "The pages," one said, almost polite, as if asking for a light. Eleanor kept her reticule against her ribs like a second heart, and answered with the formality of someone accustomed to public rooms and private wars. "What I carry for the good of those you count as nobody." "No." From the loft above, Kit's cry fell like a dropped lantern brief, bright, showing too much. Eleanor looked up and saw his pale hands gripping the rail, his terror trying to be silence and failing. Adrian moved then, the way a gentleman taught late learns to fight without flourish, with purpose, with a willingness to look ungentle as virtue requires. The river slapped the pilings with the same rhythm as a heart that has decided not to die. Fists found cheeks, a shoulder struck wood, someone grunted a prayer or a curse. Eleanor reached for the lantern on the crate, because sometimes the only way to see is to make a dangerous kind of light. She threw it, glass breaking like a prophecy fulfilled, and for a breath the world wrote itself in firewall of flame, lifting and shifting. Men's eyes turned to brightness they could not stare into. In the distraction, Adrian's men cut Kit free, and "Run," she said, into his hair, the closest thing to a blessing she knew, and the three of them fled through a smoke that smeared the night until the quay met them with hard boards and harder air. There Eleanor's arm announced a wet heat she had been ignoring, a line of pain along the flesh like a sentence scored, and when she sank to her knees, she saw Adrian's gloves turn red, not with ceremony but with life. Rain came the way London repents, sudden, thorough, making no speeches, quenching, smudging, hissing when it found what burned. Eleanor, half laughing, half faint, pressed the oilskin packet against her bodice and felt the slick promise of its survival. "Under glass," she gasped, in love with the stubbornness of things kept carefully. "Things survive." And the laugh that broke from her sounded like a bell struck once in a church that knows sorrow and refuses not to ring. By dawn, a constable Adrian trusted had Kit in hand and out of harm, the boy's shaking easing only when Eleanor's fingers threaded his hair and taught it a softer lesson than terror. The city held its breath as if listening to see whether this time the story would end in fire or in the patience of rain, and the packet of pages, dry in its skin like a heart kept warm, waited to be opened, a truth preserved for the air that would finally let it bloom. Rain stitched the window with a seamstress's care, as if the night meant to keep the narrow parlor from coming apart, and within that space Eleanor set about Adrian's wound with the formality of surgery and the tenderness of a lullaby, her jaw steady, her fingers learning his hurt as if they were apprenticed to it. Spirits stung, linen warmed in her palms, and she spoke only when instruction required it. "Hold still, my lord. Breathe with me," so that words were fewer than breaths, and the silence between them filled with the honest arithmetic of care. He was very quiet, looking not at her but at the cheap watercolor of a ship that had never left its frame, and if a thought crossed his face it was only this, that he had spent years mistaking endurance for virtue, and here was a woman who could bind a wound and leave a man more whole than before. When the kettle downstairs began its soft complaining, Mrs. Vale, hair a cloud and shawl clutched like a secret, came to the doorway and took in the scene in a single, astonishingly competent glance. Blood, steam, Eleanor's bare forearm marked with a bright, clean cut, the Duke without his coat and with his title laid aside on the chair as if it were a muffler, then moved to the hearth and set cups to rights. "Child," she said, pouring tea as if it were medicine and sacrament both, "you are blazing," and the words wore both compliment and warning like a double thread. By morning gossip had already curled at the city's edges like singe. A woman in a duke's house is a story that writes itself without facts, and London warmed its hands at that fire, inventing corridors and kisses out of steam and prudence. Adrian's letter arrived before noon, neat as a regiment, his penmanship so composed it felt like a guard posted at each margin. He offered marriage with a protectiveness as gallant as it was disastrously noble, a shield he would lift against a weather of whispers he had been bred to ignore until he found he could not. Eleanor read it with tears. She refused permission to fall. She touched the locket at her throat and felt the stubborn cool of the pressed violet under glass. Things survive, and then reached for the silver pen that had always told the truth for her when lips trembled. Her reply was gratitude and refusal, written with a hand that did not waver. Protection is not the same as respect. Let us finish what we have begun and see what remains. He received this quiet blade and, because he had learned something of humility in winter, folded his own impulse into obedience, the offer becoming not a wall but a vow deferred. Weeks passed, Distance returned in public, like a custom one honors for the sake of peace. Formal bows across crowded rooms, conversations about weather that dared nothing, and in private their work knit closer, their minds meeting over columns and entries until the ache of what might be became another weather system to navigate. Pressure and front, fog and clearing, a forecast both of them carried between shoulder blades. At midnight the silver pen resumed its small, relentless music, scratching the city awake. Eleanor wrote with mercy and measure, and London, holding a longer breath than before, seemed to listen at its own door, hearing at last the sentence she had made a promise. What is kept in the dark withers, and what is bound with care can mend without vanishing its scar. London's winter light thinned until it seemed the day itself were written on onion skin, and might tear if handled without care, and in that pallor Eleanor laid her evidence bead by bead, names and sums and roots threaded, until the rosary of it weighed in her palm like something consecrated. Mr. Fallow, gaunt and tenderly furious, stood over her shoulder with a cautious blessing. "Print it clean," he said, voice raw from smoke and sleeplessness, while her silver pen made its small, relentless music, and the page accepted, without complaint, the burden that would soon be the city's. Adrian, meanwhile, walked a corridor where damp wool held the breath of 100 petitions, and persuaded a magistrate, whose eyebrows had a life of their own, that an inquiry must be convened. His words were spare, soldier economical, the plea not for his name, but for a house built for children that had been unsettled by elegant theft. And when he left, the House of Lords murmured, as if a hive had been jostled, and was deciding whether to sting, while Hargreave, hearing of it, laughed with a mouth that showed no teeth, a mirth with edges, and no warmth at all. Lady Severin, protestation folded into her smile like poison in a sugared almond, hosted a salon where virtue was discussed as if it were a color. Would you wear compassion with sincerity, or does sincerity wash one out? And Eleanor arrived in grey, and sat very still, listening for the knife hidden in silk, offering only such remarks as would make a vain woman underestimate her. She observed a ribbon at Severin's wrist, whose weave she had seen once in a warehouse meant for blankets, and wrote the image on her palm with a fingernail. Proof must be more than recognition. That night the cost came to collect. Mr. Fallow did not arrive at the appointed hour. He was carried in near dawn with his jaw bound and his eyes fierce, the jaw wired later into silence, shaped like endurance, and still he would not be kept from the press. He sat with a pencil clutched child-tight and drew square little letters, run for, until Eleanor understood and sent the work to ink, his finger stabbing the masthead as if to say, louder. As winter slanted toward its end, a different storm gathered, letters sent and replies delayed, as if the post itself had learned caution. Servants bribed to forget corridors at odd hours, carriage wheels cutting channels in slush that froze by evening into ruts. One could not escape without ripping something delicate. In that weather, Eleanor went to Street Barton's and stood in the dormitory where small bodies breathed like tide, and she bent so near their sleep that she was half ashamed and whispered, "We are nearly there," even as doubt spooled thread through her ribs with a seamstress's patience, stitching fear to resolve so tightly it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Back at Merrow House, Adrian turned a letter over and over, a last appeal written in the tight, arrogant hand of his cousin, the word blood underlined, as if lineage could absolve a ledger, and then chose truth. He fed the paper to the grate and watched it brown, curl, and ghost itself up the flue, taking with it the last of his reluctance and leaving ash that did not quite wash from his palm, a mark he decided to bear rather than hide. Weeks passed. The city breathed shallow, the way a patient does when it knows a blade is coming, and Eleanor's column, heavy with facts set out like stepping stones, and concluded with the old refrain, "What is kept in the dark withers," while somewhere behind mirrors, Lady Severin prepared a brighter room for a darker hour, and Hargreave practiced a smile that meant to devour. The case had been made, and the cost, tallied in bruises, burned letters, and a jaw wired shut, was not finished yet. The musicale was steeped in lilac water and polite astonishment, the air ribboned with violins, and the faint chemical sweetness of candles that pretended to be spring, while snow pressed its cold face to the windows. Ladies glittered like carefully arranged constellations, and men practiced concern in mirrors until it fit, and into that curated fragrance, Viscount Hargreaves stepped with the outraged virtue of a man who has taken trouble with his performance, voice pitched to carry, eyes bright and unkind, as he produced a packet of letters whose ink looked a little too eager. A correspondence contrived to suggest that A. Glass had extorted funds and the Duke of Merrow had paid for silence. Murmurs rose and knitted themselves into a tide that licked at ankles and then, emboldened, at knees. Faces turned toward the sound as if toward a bell, and Eleanor felt the trap spring like a mousetrap beneath a careful step, her name kept under glass so long, flinging itself toward the surface, as if the pressure had become too much for the vessel to bear. Hargreave, smiling with his mouth and not his eyes, lifted a white hand and pointed with a lover's flourish that managed to be a shove. "Miss Eleanor Hart," he announced, the syllables sharpened to a blade, the scribbler behind the glass. The silence that followed sliced the room into before and after. Mrs. Vale's hand found Eleanor's and did not flutter or clutch but settled like a brace, capable and warm, as if to say, "Stand." Adrian stepped into the pause with the authority of a man who has already rehearsed ruin and found it survivable. "These letters are forgeries," he said, voice stripped of ornament, "and if you require a confession, you may have this. I knew A. Glass's identity. I chose to work with her because truth asked it." A dowager, whose jewels remembered happier skin, pronounced them shameless, her fan beating a little storm in front of her breast. A clerk from street, Barton's thin, cough-polished, his collar too clean for his pay, raised his voice from the edges and said, "Or brave," and the room split in the invisible way rooms do, not down the rug but through the rinds of people's faces, dividing believers from witnesses, appetite from conscience. Eleanor, who had learned to steady a pen in wind, steadied her voice in noise. She spoke formally, as if before a magistrate, naming dates and docks and crates bound for Southwark, naming ribbons cut from blankets and a ledger that swam and resurfaced at her call. She trembled only once, and it was when she said, "I love this city enough to anger it," a sentence that loosened something behind ribs and made a girl at the doorway put a hand to her mouth as if to keep a bird from flying out. Lady Severin's smile thinned until it showed stitching. Hargreaves' teeth flashed like filed glass. Somewhere a violinist tried and failed to continue, the bow skittering as if startled by its own nerve. "What is kept in the dark withers," Eleanor concluded, and the phrase did not float, it landed. Paper laid upon an inked plate, an impression taken. They left together not arm in arm, not daring triumph, but with the measured pace of those who have work, still to do reputations, smoking faintly in their wake. The corridor smelled of lilac dimming to soap, and outside the snow began, with a sound like silk turned in a gloved hand, to melt into rain. London's breath came damp against their faces, half judgment, half absolution, and Adrian, looking up at the sky that could not decide its weather, thought, "We will bear both." Eleanor touched the locket at her throat and thought, "Under glass we endured. Now let us be clear air." And the city, listening at its own door as it had learned to do, exhaled a little, preparing for the next word. The courtroom smelled of damp wool and old paper, a weather of its own made from bodies pressed together and attention held taut. When Eleanor stepped into that air and placed her hand upon the Bible, her glove trembled only once, a fine shiver like a bird testing a perch, and then she removed it, palm pale and steady, as if she were offering not flesh but a page for the truth to sign. She swore and sat, and the murmur that had accompanied her like a hem was swallowed by the room, with the calm of a clerk and the fire of a believer. She laid out the pattern that had cost bruise and sleep, green leather ledgers that appeared and vanished like fish, crates labelled for street, Bartons broken open at the docks and reborn as shawls in Covent Garden, sums that moved through accounts as if ashamed to be seen, and the judge's eyebrows climbed and settled, as if the very architecture of his face had to adjust to what facts can do when aligned. She kept her sentences spare, dates and docks, and names strung into a net that did not boast of its strength, it merely held. When Hargreaves' counsel attempted to coax her into speculation, she refused the luxury. "I write what I can prove," she said, and the phrase rang not like pride but like policy. Adrian, summoned, stood with his shoulders squared to something heavier than the room. He spoke without ornament about duty mislaid and found, of a trust that had turned its back, while men with charming smiles carried goods through an unlocked door. and he refused the shelter of his title in the very syntax of his answers. "I am responsible," he said, and then, facing his cousin across a gulf draped in velvet and procedure, called him by his name, Hargreave, not Viscount, as if to peel him back to the man who had written the word blood and meant ledger. Hargreave sneered, handsome as a blade, and then slipped too definite in his dates, too casual about a shipment on a night the river froze, and the room, like a schoolboy taught to keep still, leaned forward without moving. The clerk who had once gone to sea returned in a plain coat with salt still in his cuffs, and told the court how the accounts had been salted instead. Lady Severin's maid, small and tired-eyed, produced from her apron pocket a ribbon worked from the very weave Eleanor had seen on Severin's wrist, and said, in a voice that apologized to no one, that the lady liked the pattern better than blankets. Outside, a crowd gathered in the thawing light, neither jeering nor cheering, listening, as if the city had remembered its ears. And as weeks passed, while testimony and rebuttal played their sober game, attention became the new weather, not hysterical but patient, and London learned, for a little while, to inhale and not cough. In a recess, the corridor of faded portraits watched with their old eyes, as Eleanor and Adrian stood near enough to understand each other's breathing. He looked down the long tunnel of everything they had risked and asked, "After truth, what remains?" And she, who had burned and been soaked and still chose the work, answered, "What we have made." He touched her gloved hand, no flourish, just the weight and warmth of his fingers meeting the seam at her wrist, and she let him. It was the smallest and most enormous, yes, a promise not of garlands but of backbone. And when they returned to the chamber's woolen hush, Eleanor thought, with a steadiness that did not need to be brave to be true, that what is kept in the dark withers, and that they were nearly through to air. The judge's voice, when it came, was a bell that did not hurry. Each word struck and allowed its full circle of sound. He spoke of facts and of fraud, the blankets unmade by charity and made again into fashion, and when he set Viscount Hargreave and Lady Severin in the place, their deeds had earned guilty of fraud and of cruelty. The sentences fell like clean rain on parched ground, not vengeance, but weather-corrected. A murmur moved through the courtroom like wind through wheat, not wild, just relieved, and Hargreave's beautiful mouth tightened to a line that had forgotten how to be a smile, while Severin stared, as if her reflection had for the first time refused to stand where she put it. Outside, London waited with the patience it had learned. By afternoon, orders were signed and stamped, and as days few but full passed, Street. Barton's was placed beneath new governance that began with tea in chipped cups and ended with accounts that balanced, the Merrow Trust stripped bare, its shame counted, and its assets made to stand in winter light until nothing hid, then restored, not as a coronation, but as a ledger, with columns clear enough that even a child might trace the sums with a finger and not be afraid. Mr. Fallow, jaw wired and eyes fierce as a man who would gnaw through ropes by thinking, set his apprentices to ink and iron. The presses sweated, and the city's breath became a damp fog of newsprint, and on a special edition he slid beneath his masthead 2 words that were not boast but bone: "We endure." Men in coffee-houses, and women at washboards, a matron at Street Barton's who held the page as if it might warm her, all read and felt their backs right themselves. That evening, in Mrs. Vale's parlour, where tea cooled in porcelain, while the clock slicked the silence with its small, polite ticks, Adrian stood not as a duke prosecuting decorum, but as a man who had practiced humility and found it better company than pride. Kit, in the next room, pretended to count teaspoons and failed to keep his grin from running ahead of him like a stray dog. "Miss Hart," Adrian said, and his voice had none of the courtroom's steel, only the steadiness that had seen her across the dock's smoke. "I would ask you again, not to shield you, not to purchase silence for either of us, but to invite you to my life, to my labor, to my weather. Will you?" Eleanor's answer rose like a candle taking to wick. "Yes," she said, and the quiet glowed, and when he stepped forward and they kissed, it was not triumph but sealing a vow, written long before their mouths had learned the script, when it was only work, and hand to sleeve in a corridor that smelled of wool and patience. Rain tapped the window as if to be let in. The violet in her locket turned its small, stubborn face toward the day, and Eleanor, thumb brushing the glass, whispered, "Under glass, We survived. Now let us step into air. And Mrs. Vale, watching them with eyes that had measured many follies and a few rare fidelities, set the untouched tea aside as one sets aside pain. The city exhaled. Hearths breathed brighter. A child somewhere, perhaps in a ward that no longer echoed, laughed in a voice like new timber being carved, and the sound ran along the rain gutters and down into the stones, as if the very streets had learned a different way to hold weight. Months later, spring arrived like forgiveness laid gently on the city's soot-streaked shoulders. Buds made small vows on black branches, and the air, rinsed thin, seemed to carry the sound of clocks learning to keep a kinder time. And in that weather, Eleanor and Adrian were married in a ceremony as spare and radiant as truth. No trumpets, no tiaras, only her locket at her throat and her own name bright as coin on her tongue. He looked at her as if each syllable of her vow were a key turning in some long-locked door within him, and when they walked out beneath a sky freckled with pale sun, the bells did not clamour, they conversed, as if the city, too, had learned moderation and meaning. They opened the glass house in a renovated counting house, with windows thrown wide like lungs at last unbound, panes polished daily until the street could see itself seeing, ledgers placed on a table where small hands might learn that numbers are not weapons but maps, and doors that refuse to stick a hinge oiled, a handle honest so that children might practice entering without apology. There were lessons in letters and in sums, and quietly, in courage, in how to look at a threshold and not make your fear kneel to it. Eleanor wrote a column called Beginnings that smelled of soap and ink and river light. Dock workers read it on tea breaks and wiped their eyes as if grit had blown in, then folded the page into their breast pockets as if keeping a match dry against future weather, while Adrian, who had once signed drafts the size of 10 roofs without tasting the price, spent mornings at the market learning what bread costs in small loaves and how a halfpenny can alter a mother's breath. He returned with flour under his cuff and a new arithmetic of portions, of patience that looked more like prayer than like profit. Kit, all quick wrists and longening bones, became an apprentice clerk and an excellent thief of smiles. Once he slipped an apple into his coat and panicked, then brought it back with 2 more, set them down and said, face solemn as a judge, "It was interest, Mrs. Hart, Miss Eleanor," and the room laughed with a relief that taught him sums better than chalk. He added neat columns now, checking twice. His feet a little less ready to run because the world inside these windows did not chase. The city watched with wary affection, measuring this new charity by its open books and open doors. Skepticism melted slow as frost, not gone but thinning, a transparency one could see one's own face through, and as weeks passed, a habit took hold. Shopkeepers pausing by the notice board to read the accounts labelled with dates and plain speech, a magistrate sending his nephew to learn the ledger's grammar, a washerwoman standing in the doorway just to feel a room that did not expect her to creep. Their marriage ran beneath all this, like a quiet engine shared boots drying by the hearth, a habit of reading aloud that turned language into a kind of bread, a fight about the extravagance of 3 candles when 2 would do, solved by laughter, and the compromise of one sturdy flame moved closer. In bed, their breath found a shared tempo, and in daylight their hands, reaching for the same quill, learned the choreography of partnership without fuss. By summer, a storm shouldered in from the river and broke open, watering the thin garden behind the glass house, until the earth darkened to a rich, promising bruise. Eleanor stood in the doorway with rain writing on her hair and down the line of her jaw, the locket cool against her skin, and Adrian's hand at her back, steadying not possession but presence. She felt a life arrive fully then, not the spectacle, not the trial, not even the vow, but this, open windows, honest books, laughter braided into labour, a schoolyard scent of wet leaves and chalk, and the knowledge that what had once survived under glass now thrived in air. Years later, the glass house had settled into its music, the rooms humming like a hive whose bees had learned letters. Older children bent over slates beside younger ones and passed along, with a touch as light as moth-wing, the trick of making a crooked line straight, of believing, and the library exhaled that good scent of soap and paper that is the best cologne of the civilized poor. Chairs scraped softly, chalk tapped, and the street outside learned to slow when it reached their windows, as if even the horses took a quieter step to listen. Kit, no longer a rain-slicked boy but a broad-shouldered young man, with neat cuffs and ink making a steady province of his fingers, stood at the big table with columns aligned like soldiers who had laid down their rifles. He proposed an expansion, 2 more rooms made from the store beside them, a second staircase for safety, an evening class for mothers who could not daylight learn, and when Eleanor clapped, quick and bright, for the sound of it and for him, a flush mounted his cheekbones that made the child he had been shine through the man he was, and he ducked his head with a grin he could not leash. Adrian read aloud in the afternoons to a circle of small tyrants who bargained for just 1 more page with the solemn cunning of diplomats. His voice had the timbre of a man who learned softness late and loves it best, and when he made the growl of a bear or the silk of a king's whisper, faces tilted up as flowers do, and a boy with a scar at his temple leaned his head against Adrian's boot as if it were a threshold that would never close on him. Eleanor, who had given her courage as if it were bred for years, gave her name in a new way, publishing a volume of glass essays beneath Eleanor Hart. She smoothed the page where the dedication stood to those who were told to hush, to those who could not, and felt in her chest the exact place where fear had once lived loosen its hold. Copies walked the city in baskets and underarms, and at night a lamplighter was seen reading by his own blaze, her lips moving. As autumn arrived, leaves carpeted the narrow courtyard with a rustle like low applause. Eleanor and Adrian walked there arm in arm, the kind of ease that comes only from earned trust, warming the air between their sleeves, and the city, which had once coughed on its own secrets, breathed easily. It had learned a little to hold itself accountable and hold itself dear. They went back to Street Barton's on a day as clear as a bell. There were linens white enough to shame clouds and books honest as bread, spines mended by careful hands. The matron, who had once rehearsed gratitude like a line, now cried without rehearsal and dabbed her eyes on a handkerchief sewn from a remnant of those misused blankets, waving it as if it were a flag whose color meant victory and not surrender. In their window at home the locket still caught light like a small chapel. Beneath glass, the violet endured with its patient purple, a miniature proof of stubbornness, and when the afternoon drew long and the lamps were lit, the rooms of the glass house glowed with the particular gold of a good ledger at balance and a better heart at rest. Eleanor touched the locket and thought, not with ache now but with admiration, under glass we learn to live. Outside glass, the life grows wild and right, and the wind that scrolled along Fleet Street sounded not like warning but like a page turned toward more. On an ordinary evening, when the lamps threw their patient circles and the city's pulse was a manageable thrum, the table at the glass house was laid for many, spoons lined like quiet soldiers, bowls breathing steam, a loaf with its crust crackled open to reveal the ordinary miracle of bread. Beside the plates lay a ledger, thumbed and honest, its columns squared so neatly that even the crumbs seemed to fall in order, and somewhere a child laughed at a joke so small it fit perfectly in a life so large. This, at last, was the shape of their triumph. Not trumpets, not marble, but the humble balance of accounts and hearts. A household where courage did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Dear listener, there is a kind of courage that looks like patience, the daily discipline of not turning away. There is a kind of love that looks like attention, the unglamorous watch kept at thresholds others hurry past, and there is a kind of truth that will not live unless it is aired, not as a shout that wounds but as a window opened, a draught that enlivens a room and banishes the damp. Consider how Eleanor's pen and Adrian's name were not made weapons. They were tools, one sharp to carve, one broad to brace, and with them they built a place where children learned letters and bread's arithmetic, where ledgers lay open like clear water, and where no one need live forever under glass. Preserved, yes, but unbreathed. They kept a violet in a locket to remember what survives in shelter, and they opened doors to learn what blooms in light. In your days, when silence seems the safer currency, remember the refrain that traveled our streets and printed itself upon the city's ribs. What is kept in the dark withers. What is brought gently to light can grow. Your voice is a key, your care a lantern, and even a small beam can make a way through. Be tender with the self you hide, the frightened creature that learned to hold its breath. Offer it a chair at your own table, a sip of warmth, a kinder name. Say the difficult word to someone who can bear it. No, enough. Help, here I am and stand, not ahead like a savior, and not behind like a rumor, but beside those who risk themselves for a better kindness, as steady and unboastful as a hand at the small of a back. May your evenings find you with a warm cup and a ledger of the day that balances to grace. May there be a friend whose listening is a hearth, and a window where rain writes its thin, legible poems you can almost read. May your sleep be untroubled, and your waking honest. Thank you for lending your quiet hours to this tale, for walking its fog and its clearings. Should you wish to journey again, return to these pages, and we will meet where stories begin, as they always have for us, from the first breath to the first ink, as London, older and kinder by a measure, exhales, and the glass, having held what needed keeping, shines without keeping you from the air.